Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Way the World Works. So we had a lot of holiday episodes, a lot of, Christmas-themed episodes, but it is still winter. It's still chilly outside. And so I want to talk about something that is more, it did happen around or on Christmas, but it's less Christmas time related, but I think it's still very applicable to what we talk about here. And that is the story of George Washington crossing the Delaware. So what does this mean? This is a very pivotal moment of the Revolutionary War. This, honestly, it kind of changed the game. So first, let me talk about what I mean by the Delaware. That does not mean the state. The Delaware River is in the East Coast, and it shares borders with New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and you guessed it, Delaware. So that is the river in question, but let's talk about why this matters. So by December 1776, and this is Christmas Day, the Continental Army was exhausted and starving. They were losing battle after battle. They were starting to retreat across New Jersey. They were shrinking because soldiers were either deserting because things did not look good, or their enlistments were about to expire, because when you signed up for the Continental Army, it was for a certain period of time. And once people saw what was going on, they're like, heck no, I'm not going back. This is not a great situation for me. So they are retreating, they are shrinking, and they are seen by many as doomed. At one point they called this the winter of the red snow because there were soldiers who didn't even have shoes. And so they were leaving, and they were wounded. So they were leaving blood in the snow. I mean, this is not great. Okay. It is not ideal. So British and Hessian forces basically believed the war was over. They believed they won. And Hessian, so Britain was real sneaky, or real, I guess, tactical in this way, but they were hiring mercenaries. They were hiring foreign armies to help them. And so the Hessians were these paid mercenaries, these paid soldiers that weren't actually British. So we're going to set the stage there. This is where we're beginning this heroic moment for both George Washington, which really solidified him as an American hero and completely changed the outcome of the war, completely changed morale even in the colonies. So I've set the stage. You see how dire the situation was. So imagine now it's Christmas night. If you've ever been in the East Coast in the winter, you know that it's a humid kind of cold, and it doesn't matter how many clothes you put on, it almost like it seeps through your clothes. And I'm from Utah, where it's dry and cold, and it doesn't feel as bad there. Now that I live in Washington, D.C., or Virginia, actually, it's a whole other kind of cold. So remember that when you're hearing the story. It's Christmas night, 1776. Snow was falling. The river is freezing, and most soldiers are cold. They're hungry. They're far from home. They're over this war. Okay, they are just done. And they're losing. I mean, they are losing hope. Haven't seen their families in forever. But their commander, General George Washington, you may have heard of him, gives an order that seems impossible: cross the Delaware River tonight. I want you to put yourself in their shoes. I don't like being cold. Imagine being so cold, some of them not even having proper attire, shoes, coats, and your leader is asking you to cross the Delaware, the freezing river. And so, why? Why would he do this? Was he just being mean? Did he have a plan? George Washington was very calculated. He was a very good general. There's a reason he was given that post to begin with. So the reason he asked them to is because freedom was on the line. And even on Christmas, courage doesn't take a holiday. So the Christmas plan was actually kind of genius if you think about it, because Christmas wasn't always celebrated on December the 25th, but at this point it was well established in Europe. And obviously because the colonies were following British traditions, it was well established there too. But here's one thing George Washington knew. He knew that it was Christmas night. And so the British, hired Hessians who were nearby. They were going to be celebrating, okay? And they were celebrating in a town called Trenton. And so Washington is like, all right, they're celebrating right now. What if I take 2,400 men and quietly lead them to the edge of the Delaware River? Okay. And again, ice chunks are filling this river. So they're like ferrying soldiers, like they're on like horses and cannons. So they're riding the cannons across, and they're like in wooden boats, right? So they're like bringing all this stuff and tiny little wooden boats. And the password, because they would have passwords so you would know that you were part of that, was victory or death. And, that sounds hyperbolic, but I mean, that at this point, morale is so low. And I think so many people figured they were going to die anyway, that this was their password. This was their, how they were signaling to each other they were on the same team. It was quite extraordinary to be in that situation. And that's your mantra. this isn't like a quick thing, right? And especially because they're trying to do it quietly so they aren't seen. So they don't reach the other side of the river until dawn. So they have been in this freezing water all night long, and it's freezing cold outside, not just, the wind is blowing. It's awful. So he leads his men 9 miles to Trenton and surprised the Hessian troops because they never saw it coming. They were out celebrating, and remember, here's an interesting thing about the entire revolution. A lot of the British generals, and this was their mistake, and some of them weren't against this, they, weren't counting on the Americans to be such a formidable foe. All right. They thought they were a bunch of like almost kind of hillbilly, like country simpleton, backcountry, colonials that didn't know anything about fighting a battle, forgetting that a lot of them had actually, like George Washington, served in the French and Indian War. So they definitely knew a lot about battle, but they discounted their ability to win this war. But that puts the Americans in a really unique position, because if somebody doesn't expect much out of you, you can rely on them to discount your ability and then swoop in and do something grand, which is exactly what George Washington did. So when they arrive in Trenton, this sparks the Battle of Trenton. And it was over, guys, in less than an hour, because again, they caught them by surprise so much that it wasn't even a contest. But what's crazy about this, you have to remember, is they are cold, Americans, cold, hungry, but they had just spent their whole night, their Christmas nights, crossing a river that they were like, no, again, victory or death, we're going to do this. So this is a huge moment. Why? Because they needed a win. Have you ever heard people be like, I just need a win today? They needed a win. They needed anything to help them know that hope was going to happen, that hope was nearby. And so now they win, right? Great for morale. They're all happy. They capture supplies, thank goodness, because again, they're hungry, they're starving, they don't have shoes. So all of a sudden, they spark what is the most powerful, probably, feeling in the world, and that is hope. Okay, so these soldiers, for the first time in forever, are finally thinking, oh my goodness, could we win this war? Could we actually get independence for ourselves? And that is huge. So, for those who questioned George Washington, the night before, saying like, is this bro crazy? Like, this dude wants us to cross this freezing river without shoes? And it was that one daring decision. And it was trusting that George Washington knew what he was doing. And of course, you never wonder that George Washington could have been like, goodness, I hope that this works, because nothing in life is certain, especially battle plans. But so people, they started to trust George. I mean, they already did, but they trusted him more. They started to really trust his judgment and his ability to lead them to victory. And they started realizing that victory could actually happen. And this is huge. So news obviously spreads across the colonies. And honestly, hope is like a tiny little spark. And even if you just have a tiny spark of hope, just like a real spark, that can catch on really quickly, right? And all of a sudden, the flames of liberty, the flames of passion, the flames of reminding them what they're fighting for, completely reignited. All of a sudden, like I said, morale skyrockets. The public is also regaining faith in their ability to win the war and starting to realize, like, oh my goodness, is this going to happen? Are we going to become a proper country? Are we going to get our independence? This is a big one, because remember, the army was depleting. People were going home, whether they were abandoning or just not re-enlisting. But this is inspiring people. So now people start to re-enlist instead of going home. And I mean, you can't win a war without an army. So this is huge, guys. So the newspapers are, spreading this news of Washington's heroic win. And, Washington is kind of a larger than life character for us as Americans. And, there's the whole chopping the cherry tree down, if you remember that story, which is not real, but it's like these stories. Remember, we've talked about myth, even if it's not real, being very important. But there's, George Washington is a larger than life character for us. And the reason he is because of these decisions and these victories. Is he became the beacon of hope and the symbol of military strength, and that, America, we are not just this ragtag, army. And, a lot of times the reason people thought that is there was the Continental Army, but then you also had these militias, which were just like townsmen who were taking up arms. And parents, if you've seen the movie The Patriot, you remember the Continental Army was kind of, they had mixed feelings, because the militia were often getting scared during battle and running away. And that's Mel Gibson's character character. His whole thing is he's trying to, get them to not retreat. And so both played a role, but they definitely needed official people to enlist in the army. And that's what they were getting now, thanks to this really big victory. Now, sparking hope, why is that important? Because when you're sparking hope and you're going into more battles, you're going to have, hopefully, better success, right? And this is exactly what happened. So there was actually a second victory at Trenton. It was called the Battle of Assunpink. I'm probably saying that wrong. Assunpink Creek. I'm trying to say it correctly as much as I can, but I don't know if that's correct. And then you also had the Battle of Princeton. I can say that one, which was also another surprising American win. And so this is, all of a sudden, these losers are winning 3 battles in a row. And this campaign really forced the British to, first of all, take Americans seriously, and second, to march out of New Jersey. And this was proving that not only could we fight, but hey, we could win. And not even just against British, who in many circumstances, I think we forget that it was kind of a civil war, because some of the British fighters, the Americans were Englishmen for, most of their lives. And that was why they were revolting, because as Englishmen, they knew their rights as Englishmen were being violated by the king, who was treating the colonists like second-class citizens. So these are their brethren in a lot of ways, but they're not only beating them, they're also beating these Hessians, who were known for being such good fighters that people were paying them to fight for them. All right, so all of a sudden, soldiers are trusting Washington. Britain is taking American Army, the Continental Army, seriously. The public is, their faith is restored that they are fighting for a cause that can be won. And also now you have, so for a long time, France was not willing to give America financial support because, well, one, remember, they had just gotten out of a war, the French and Indian War with Britain. But because of that, they also have some hurt pride, right? So in a way, that does give them a little bit of an incentive to fight. But the revolution had seemed like a lost cause to everyone at this point. So now France is saying, okay, we see you, George Washington. I see that you're able to do this. And so now they're thinking maybe this isn't going to be a lost cause. Maybe this is something we should invest in. And without that foreign aid, the revolution would have almost certainly failed. And it's funny because we like to tease the French all the time just because it's funny to tease the French. I love the French. I speak French. Kind of. But we needed them. They helped us win the war. So that was, this was all because of Washington crossing the Delaware. And so there's a really beautiful, famous portrait or painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. And again, it's very, like I said, it's almost like a legend or a myth for American folklore, even though it really happened, because it's just this moment of Washington really being larger than life. And it symbolizes, American grit. That's who we are as Americans. We were the underdog, but, we persevered against impossible odds. We will always choose, bold action over slow defeat. And we refuse to give up. That is in the American spirit. Like we shouldn't. On paper, we should not have won that war, shouldn't have won it. And that is what is so remarkable, many reasons, but about our revolution. So this is a real turning point for the war. This is, you might be able to say that this partially why we won the war. And it's incredible. So again, this is not a Christmas episode, but it kind of is because it happened on Christmas. One thing I always remember whenever I feel cold in the winter is like, ooh, at least I'm not crossing the Delaware, right? But a really important moment for American history, really solidified, honestly, our character and how we view ourselves too. Like I said earlier, there's that painting that really kind of shows you that. And it was, so it's a 1851 painting by Emmanuel Lutz. I think I said that correctly. And it's, again, so iconic because it embodies the spirit of the American character. This is how we saw ourselves. This is how we saw George Washington. So check out that painting, look at it, maybe discuss it as a family. I will leave it there. As always, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast. And until next time, I will talk to you later.